Welcome to the second lecture in Module 6, and in this lecture we'll cover the basics of the HTML syntax. Now, this syntax was available in the earliest versions of the World Wide Web. And here's a quote I like from Tim Berners-Lee, who's considered the father of the World Wide Web. It just took this idea of the hypertext and then to connect it to the TCP and DNS ideas, and ta-da, we have the World Wide Web. So that, again, shows that this was present in the very earliest versions of the Internet. However, how it was used and how it's been evolved over time has changed extensively, and that's what we'll talk about now. So there's a working group that was created by the International Engineering Task Force that released this version 2.0 of the HTML way back in 1995, and most of the elements that are in that, they continue to support them as they continue to define standards. And we're up to now HTML version 5. If you go to www.w3.org, you can see the specification for HTML. And there's a number of places online where you can find tutorials on how to use HTML. So let's talk a little bit more about the design principle that you should follow when using HTML. And it's based on this thing called the separation of content and presentation. Very important to respect this design principle when you design web pages. What this means is that the semantics of a document should be separated from what the user sees. So the meaning should be separated from how it appears, how it's styled. And here's the advantage of this design principle. If you have the structure of the document specified someplace and how it's styled separately specified, you can change what that document looks like by just changing the styling of the document. You don't have to go in and edit the document itself, just its styling. This is a way to provide accessibility to a website. For example, it may be you want to read the content. You may have a user who wants the content read to them. So there's various things that can be done if you follow this design principle. The other thing that's a big advantage, and it's a typical advantage in software engineering, is that you can change things in one place. If you've got the styling spread throughout a document, it's very difficult to create a consistent design if you have to go through all sorts of elements and figure out, for example, I changed the section heading in the section heading itself, then I've got to go through all the section headings to do that. But if that's separated off into a style sheet, you change the section heading one place and all of the section headings are changed. So it's you can change the entire graphic design of a website. And I'll show you that in a future lecture, how the entire design of a website can be made look completely different with the same content. Very powerful what you can do with cascading style sheets. So the other thing that happens, and this leads into Web 3.0 types of scenarios, is that if you can capture the meaning of a document, then computers can use that to determine things about that document. So further intelligent machine processing can occur if you're capturing the semantics or the meaning of a document. And there's actually a tag that we'll see in HTML that allows you to specify this. It's called the meta tag, and it allows you to attach meta information to a website. Now, markup languages are examples of something called declarative programming languages. And it's just like what the name says. You're declaring that this is a header, or this is a paragraph, and that's what a declarative programming language looks like. So how is this different from other types of programming languages? Well, there's no flow control here. You're not specifying the flow of control through a program. You're just specifying what something is. So you specify what something is, not how to compute something with declarative programming languages. In the case of markup languages, such as HTML, this means you're specifying what things should look like on a web page. Not how they should appear, but what should appear. If created properly, then HTML documents look like this. This is an example of a declarative, a declaration. Here is a div or a division in a document, and within that division we have an H1 header called introduction. H1 means it's a level 1 heading, the highest level heading. And what we'll see is we can attach stylings to this header or to this division through a separate file called a style sheet, and we'll see more about that in a future lecture. So the important thing to understand about HTML is that each individual component in an HTML document is an element, and that element can be styled. This is how we're going to do things. We're going to style those elements. The elements themselves form a tree structure, and this is how this is actually used extensively in your browser to understand how you should style the content that's in the web page is by investigating and going through that tree structure and styling specific elements. Now here's what every HTML element looks like this. It has a start tag, and you already saw that div with the angle brackets, and then it had an end tag, the div with a slash angle brackets. But you can also have additional attributes inside. So start tag, attributes, end tag. This is what all all HTML elements. And between the start and the end tag, you can have content. And so if you think back to the one I just showed you for the H1 or the level 1 heading, there was content in the middle of that. It was introduction. It was the title of that heading. So again, here it is. Now there's something different here. There's this ID equal main panel. If you look at that ID equal main panel, we're going to use that. We're going to see later on. That's how we're going to style this. We have to identify these elements so that we can later apply style rules to them. You can also have, and we've already seen this, you can nest, this is what creates the tree structure, by the way. You can nest elements inside of other elements. So here's this div again, and it's got two children, an H1 or a level 1 heading and a level 2 heading. So we would say that div is the parent, has two children. The parent-child relationship, again, is the thing that leads to that tree structure. Very, very important to understand that. Now, a listing of all of the available HTML tags you can find them at this w3schools.com. So go to w3schools.com tags and take a look at them. It's the best resource available for looking at the elements that are available in HTML. Now, the attributes are very important. So again, we have the start tag that can contain attributes and an end tag and the content in between. That makes up an HTML element. The attributes provide additional meaning. And again, we talked about HTML as specifying the semantics or meaning of a document. And here's how you specify attributes. It's just a list of name-value pairs that are enclosed in quotes and separated by an equal sign. So here's an example. You've already seen one. We saw this, and this is the same one as before, but I've added one more attribute here. So we've got the div, and then the attributes here are an ID attribute and a class attribute. And again, it's the same thing. It's a list. There's no commas between the elements in this list. So the first element in this list is ID equal, and then in quotes, main panel. The second element of the list is class equal, in quotes, modern. And again, these attributes we'll use them to help style these elements later on. But again, the important thing to recognize here is that those are HTML element attributes. The ID attribute is very important. Almost every HTML element can hold an ID attribute. So it's a global attribute. One thing that's required for the ID attribute, it has to be unique. You can't give two HTML elements the same ID. The class can be shared by many, but the ID must be unique. So the class is typically, if you want to style a collection of elements, you use class. Again, we'll see more about this later. What you need to understand now is how to create an HTML element. Now, one of the most important HTML elements is the anchor. This is how you create a link. And so it's this A element that I'm showing you here. And here's an example of how you create a link. You use the anchor, and we've already seen that this href that I'm showing you here, that's an attribute, and it's specified just like an attribute. You have the attribute equal, and then in quotes, the value for the attribute. And so this is what's used to create links. So it creates something like I'm showing you here, this Amazon, and your browser automatically puts a underline and colors it blue generally. And so this event attribute has been attached to this anchor, and your browser knows that when that's clicked, it's going to go to that URL. So we'll look more at how to use that later, but I want to provide one more example here at the bottom of the page that shows another anchor element that has the has the attribute href defined, so that's where this, when you click on this link, this is where you're going to go. But I've defined something else called on mouse over. And this is I'm defining some behavior here. So when you move your mouse over this link, it's actually going to run this JavaScript code called notice.js. And this is one place where you can supply behaviors. We're going to see generally, and I want you to see this because as you're inspecting web pages, you may see something like this. So you can put this behavior right in the attribute, but more common we're going to see nowadays is we'll pull that out and we'll define behavior in a separate JavaScript file. But be aware that it can happen as an attribute as well. Now, in earlier versions of HTML, formatting elements found their way into the specification, right? So you could do things like this. Here's an H1 heading called Introduction, and I'm specifying that the font should be Arial, it should be 20 pixels, and the color is black, and that's what this is saying. That's been deprecated now. Generally, these things, if you look at the current specification of HTML, it tells you don't do this, don't do this, do this type of stuff using cascading style sheets. So I'm going to tell you now, don't do this. Don't ever do this. If you take this class from me and I find that you've done something like this, I'm going to have to go into the internet and hunt you down, because don't ever do this. This is breaking this principle of separating the presentation from the contents. The content and presentation are clearly intertwined here. So again, don't ever do this. And let me reiterate again, you're going to see, if you go to the W3 schools and look at some of the tags, it's going to tell you not supported in HTML5. Everyone's recognized that this is a bad thing to do. Now, let's quickly look at how these styling rules are, how everything comes together. So on the browser side, there's this collection of HTML elements that I'm showing you in the middle here. That's the document structure that's being specified. And then you style it. And so in the upper part, we see the cascading style sheets. They come together to style the elements in that document. And then the JavaScript, which I'm showing there on the bottom, they're applied to the elements in that web page to give it the interactivity. All of this comes together in something called the DOM, the Document Object Model. And that DOM is living inside your browser, and that's what gets rendered. And we'll see that there's another step to this. As the HTML is provided to your browser, there'll be links, HTML links, that'll say go back and grab this cascading style sheet, or go back and grab this JavaScript from the web server that gave the HTML content, or in many cases, from some other place, from some other web server will provide those elements to you. So this is how all of these pieces come together to create the document view, which I show being rendered using a renderer inside your browser. So it's very important, again, to understand that we're going to specify the HTML elements, and then later on we're going to provide the styling, and then we're going to provide the behaviors. 3 different ways, 3 different locations for these things. And that's the very, very important design principle behind the presentation layers, to separate these things. So this completes the second lecture in Module 6.